observing an election for the first time, a nation vote for its first time in history in that picture there, which was quite a moving moment. I love the framing that Rob set up here of what's the big idea and then what's the implementation. So our big idea is that we should reform election governance to reduce political party influence, limit conflicts of interest, increase fairness and trust, and prepare for a multi-party future. So election governance is not all that familiar term. What do we mean? And we mean the positions responsible for decisions and oversight that affect how elections are run. These include items like what we bulleted here, the Secretary of State position, election boards, redistricting bodies, officials managing ballot initiatives. We make the distinction between governance and election administration because governance functions have more discretion, more impact on results and trust, and often more impact on what's on the ballot, as opposed to sort of what happens at a polling station. Election governance across the US is largely controlled by partisan elected or party appointed people. And that's pretty dangerous, particularly now in our toxic, polarized world where the parties see each other as existential threats and really feel they must use any leverage they have to win. And all of that puts a lot of pressure on election officials and a lot of pressure on this partisan system. Of course, we're very different than any other democracy. We're the only major democracy that elects election officials in partisan elections, the only one that allows officials to campaign for candidates, the only one that allows legislatures to draw their own districts. Point 6 here is pretty important as well. It's a different category, but we alone have had no new party emerge and rise to power, which illustrates sort of our unique binary two-party system. And we really need to think of governance as being in that context and in some ways being part of the factors that contribute to it and need to be changed if we're going to make any progress on that really problematic nature of our country. So we at ERN focus on all 4 of the bullet points here in our work on election governance. For today, I'm going to talk about the top 2, but we can touch on the others in questions if people are interested. So I want to focus on ballot measures and on the increasing manipulation of ballot measures. 26 states allow citizens to raise initiatives to amend constitutions, change laws, change how the government functions. In all of those states, key phases are controlled by officials such as attorney generals and secretaries of state. They've shown increasing willingness to use that control to block popular reforms. And we've also seen a lot of legislative rollback. Approximately 20% of past initiatives have been repealed. Problem 2, on the Secretary of State side, most secretaries of state act neutrally, admirably, but those who don't do hurt elections and voter trust. An example, 8 secretaries of state took their states out of ERIC because they didn't want to debunk a conspiracy theory. We've seen rates of about 30% of secretaries of state endorsing candidates. Voter trust, a poll we did found that only 55% of voters said that they had confidence their chief election officer would resolve a disputed election fairly. That's not as high as we should have. These 2 themes, Secretary of State theme and the ballot measure theme, come together in this case study of the 2024 Issue 1 ballot measure in Ohio, trying to create an independent redistricting commission, which was really derailed by misleading ballot language backed by the Secretary of State and by the partisan elected Supreme Court. The language is there. It claimed that the commission would be required to gerrymander, which accounts for the crazy, confusing signs, conflicting signs that you see there. Solutions exist. On the ballot measure side, there will be ballot measures in 2026 in Missouri and Arkansas and probably other states that introduce these kinds of reforms that set fairness standards for ballot language, that create a supermajority requirement for repeals, and that end this game of kind of removing the goalposts that we've seen a lot of. Goalposts, say, for example, around signature requirements. On the Secretary of State side, there's a whole range of solutions that are summarized here, some relatively easy legislative solutions, such as the ones on the left, and we'll be introducing laws advocating for those ideas in some states. We like the stepping stone metaphor that laws that would prevent a Secretary of State from running for a higher office until a number of years have passed, which would increase the likelihood of someone coming to that position for a long-term career basis rather than to as a stepping stone in their career. We also like the board appointment model under the changing selection category, but there's a range of different options. Um, 2026 will be a big year in Secretaries of State issues because in 20 states, there'll be a Secretary of State who is overseeing his or her own election. Also, 23 states will elect a Secretary of State. In the last cycle, we had a whole lot of kind of negative news cycles around their distrust in the last election or their support for debunked ideas. We will be uplifting neutrality in 2026 and uplifting secretaries who conduct conflict of interest assessments. Um, I want to step back now and sort of look at the bigger picture, and this kind of reflects why we really love this field. Because election governance is a way to achieve near-term wins that matter in things like reducing conflict of interest, increasing fairness and trust, and at the same time enabling longer-term wins. And this slide with some animation will sort of illustrate this. So we have these two paths that I outlined, ballot measure fairness on the left, Secretary of State neutrality, these time periods. And what we want to achieve is build greater fairness in the ballot measures in the near term in order to enable reforms like independent redistricting commissions, which have been sidetracked by ballot measure manipulation in many states, and then later on enabling other deeper reforms that get at the two-party problem that we've talked about. And I think folks know there's a lot of interest developing in really bold changes in that area. The Secretary of State neutrality path is a little bit similar. Leverage the 2026 elections to elevate the concept of neutrality and how elections are run, expand reforms in following years, and introducing more sort of non-party models, for example, in how election boards are run, and ultimately have election governance no longer be an advocate for the duopoly, but rather a facilitator of elections however they are run. We have found this slide's detailed a bit more there. We have found a lot of support in polling for these kinds of ideas. Americans care about election official neutrality. This poll from MIT finds that 77% of voters support only selecting election officials in a nonpartisan manner. And you can see by how close the dots are that this is a highly bipartisan support. So it's more bipartisan and stronger support than a lot of other familiar reforms like RCV and automatic voter registration. On the risk side, this slide shows that nearly 70% of voters agree that it is difficult to trust the impartiality of an election official elected with the support of a political party. In other words, with an official elected in the way we do so now. So that there's in sum, reforming election governance has broad bipartisan support, is a promising area for important near-term wins that increase fairness and trust and can enable a multi-party future. Thank you, and I really look forward to your feedback.
Thank you, Kevin. Right on time, too.
Right
Really
on
great
time.
presentation. And let's go over to Phil for his response. Phil Kiesling, former Oregon Secretary of State.
All right. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for the great presentation and the really thoughtful work that lies behind it. I want to encourage everybody who hasn't to take a look at it. A couple of key points I want to respond to, but first a little bit of background. I was Secretary of State back in the 1990s. And arguably during that era, at least in Oregon, it really felt that it mattered to voters whether you were seen as a fair umpire or not, called the balls and strikes right. I had to do legislative redistricting, and Republicans were pleasantly surprised that it was, quote, fairer than they expected. I lost some Democratic friends. I was a Democrat. I put David Duke on the ballot and then enraged the Republicans because he was a legitimate candidate and they were embarrassed that he was running. Doesn't this all sound quaint back in the days, right? And I then had a ballot measure that asked me to take off an anti-gay ballot measure, which I abhorred from a policy point of view, but I was urged by the left to strip it from the ballot on a theory that the legislature could certainly put a ballot measure like that on the ballot, but the citizens couldn't through the initiative. And it gets to this issue of whether the initiative and the legislature were co-equal branches of government. Um, but I think today, and particularly after 2020, way too many voters are rewarding secretaries of state for whether you're on our side or not. Are you wearing our team colors? And this has happened so quickly and so deeply that several years ago, I actually started talking to people in Oregon about, is it time to departisanize the Oregon Secretary of State office? And Kevin did not go into this too deeply, but there's so many local election officials that are also elected on a partisan basis. Oregon in 1997, I believe, at the request of the county clerks, we have 36 of them, departisanized it. But it took an act of the Oregon legislature to do it because county clerks were defined as state offices under state statute, required to be elected with getting Democratic and Republican nominations. I tried to find out, by the way, for this presentation, just how many local elected officials around the country aren't just elected, but are elected on a partisan basis where they first have to navigate a Democratic or a Republican primary. Maybe I don't know how to use Chat GPT well enough, but they basically came back saying, I'm sorry, we don't have that data. But if you think about it, all politics are local or mostly local. That's a real avenue for reform too. So how quickly this ground has shifted underneath our feet, and the Ohio example was I think a great one about the gerrymandering. And by the way, the Secretary of State was running for another partisan office, I think, at the time that that happened, which was the United States Senate, and needed to win a Republican nomination. So what's happened, of course, is that if you're an elected official, state or local, running for a partisan nomination, especially on the Republican side, do you have to dissemble or at worst lie about your feelings about whether the 2020 election was fair? We should never put people in that position who are in that. And I think that was a really core point of what Kevin and election reform networks are doing. Um, so um, that's a framing about the importance of departisanizing. But I also really appreciated the work because it's not quite that simple either. Okay, if you live in a heavily Republican dominated or Democratic county or a state, okay, just because you're elected on a nonpartisan basis, don't have to navigate a Democratic or Republican primary, does that kind of take you off the hook? No, not at all. I mean, you're still going to probably, you can't prevent local parties, state parties from supporting candidate A over candidate B. You can't prevent people who used to be a Republican, maybe in the state legislature. Now I'm nonpartisan, but are they really? So I think one of the key ideas that the group has put forward is a hybrid approach where it's not just enough to try to departisanize these offices, and I really do think that the time has come for that, but you have to put other things in place as well. And it's not that you strip the Secretary of State, let's say, of all of her or his powers, but you significantly confine them with things like boards and other people that join. And I want to particularly note the importance of the non-affiliated world right now. It's the biggest single choice that Oregon voters make. We're a party registration state. There are more non-affiliated voters today than Democrats or Republicans. And yet so much of our laws and structures been on automatic pilot for a century or more. Oh yeah, there's Democrats and there's Republicans. They put two-party system. No, we have two major parties, we have multiple minor parties, and we have none of the above people in here. So I really like the idea of the boards and constraining the power. I'm not necessarily think that you have to require a Secretary of State to have been a former election official herself or himself, particularly if you confine those powers. I certainly didn't have that experience, but I do think that you have to be cognizant of nonpartisan elections are not sufficient, necessary, but not necessarily deficient. I also really, in the short term, think getting groups that are seen as fair and nonpartisan, League of Women Voters, let's say, to construct pledges that ask the people running for Secretary of State, do you promise A, B, and C? And put some meat on that and try to get people to say, well, that's perfectly reasonable for a position like this. You can't change the partisanship of these offices, but you can demand in a public way to get them to pledge to certain things. Also, I think local initiatives are important. I love the idea of initiatives to protect the initiative process. Arkansas and Montana, though, don't use the initiative very often. And what really would matter is to have things like that happen in places like California, Oregon, and Washington. In my 9 years as Secretary of State, by the way, I think I oversaw more initiative petitions placed on the ballot than any other human being in the history of the country up to that point. And it's not necessarily a record I cherish, but I do think the initiative is really important. And how many states have a local initiative like Oregon does? At the county level, we can change the law. We could change the partisan nature of election officials, for example, at the local level. Just a couple of other thoughts that I think are really important, but I have to tell you, I was just super impressed with the work that Kevin and his group are doing, is trying to make this an issue in state legislative campaigns too. Um, uh, are there ways that you can convince state legislative candidates running in competitive districts to try to draw contrast with their opponents by talking about the kinds of reforms that they would push for if they get elected to the state legislature? Because in 25 states without the initiative, that's the only choice you have. You have to go through a state legislature. How do you put the pressure on state legislatures? And I think that is going to be a huge challenge, but we're seeing some real interesting dynamics going on at the state legislative level with people winning in races they weren't expected to win. And can this issue be used as a wedge to differentiate and try to rebuild trust back in voters? There's no magic bullet. These things aren't going to make go from night to day, but real steps forward. Thank you very much. Great job.
All right. Hey, thank you, Phil. We were
Music.
going to go to breakouts immediately, but I thought that I just wanted to invite Kevin, just in the flow of conversation, if he had to take a minute, 90 seconds or so to respond to anything that Phil just shared before we go to breakouts. Or Kevin, do you feel we're ready
Sure.
to go?
No. I just want to, I think everything that Phil raised is great. I mean, I think the focus on the local is really important, and there's a large number of election officials who are elected. They tend to have, at the local level, they tend to have a little bit less sort of hands on the steering wheel, or less discretion. They're actually more conscribed by election law. But there are some appearance problems. Michigan's a really interesting example in this case. In Michigan, county clerks are required by law to be members of their party's county commission, county executive commission. Imagine that. You're required by law to go to the meeting that decides how you're going to win the elections that you're responsible for overseeing. So these are some of these, as you said, these kind of autopilot legacy systems that we have. Oregon and Washington have done the local option model, which ranked choice voting people have also taken good advantage of, to allow counties that want a different approach to do so. And so that's allowed both states to change some of their clerks to elected on a nonpartisan basis. And I know that we were recently interviewing clerks in Washington, and those who have that nonpartisan status really, really like it. And it's very interesting talking to they are auditors in Washington, and talking to auditors in counties that don't have that, who run independent just because they don't want the party to give them the call. And they know all it will take will be a candidate someone putting their name forward saying, no, I'm running as the R candidate. They lose. Their 20 years of experience is gone, but they want I next to their name so they're not exposed to the call from the party. I thought that was really telling commentary. But thank you.
All right.
Your points were great.
Thanks to both of you. So we'd like to